Possibilities Wisława Szymborska. Before analysing the body of the poem, reference to the interesting yet simplistic title will be made. By merely naming the poem Possibilities, it can be inferred that such a title is ambiguous in its explicit meaning, but hints at themes of chaos and lack of confinement that rhizomatic situations tend to bring about. Furthermore, it brings about a sense of hope that possibilities commonly contain, and thus it can be argued that the reader would assume a positive poem to follow. Moving on to the body of the poem, one can clearly perceive its lack of stanzas and rhyme schemes, and thus this structure instantly gives off the impression of chaos and playfulness, which is further supported by the content within the poem, which will be explored later. To begin, the speaker plainly states, "I prefer movies, I prefer cats." Both somewhat frivolous preferences, a tone of nonchalance can be noted, as well as a sense of individuality through the first-person personal pronoun I, which adds to the lack of structure in the poem. The poem continues in the third line to state, "I prefer the oaks along the water." The water is a river in western central Poland, and thus it can be interpreted that the speaker's geographical identity is being revealed to be of Polish origin, and is perhaps Szymborska herself directly highlighting her preferences, rather than an unknown speaker that is usually utilised in poems. Furthermore, a clear trend in "I prefer" can be noted, which is a more ambiguous phrase than the typical phrase "I like," and thus arises the question as to whether the speaker is speaking in admiration for each of these preferences or mere tolerance. It can also be interpreted that these preferences link with the title Possibilities, in that the vast array of preferences humans possess is an indication of the vast array of possibilities available in order to make these preferences possible. Continuing on in line 4, yet another personal preference is made, this time about authors. As she states, "I prefer Dickens to Dostoevsky." This yet again adds to the individuality that is being constructed through these preferences, and perhaps contributes to an overarching message that individuality evokes an immensity of possibilities. The following line is of a much less trivial note, as it states, "I prefer myself liking people to myself loving mankind." Yet another individualistic preference, it can be interpreted that the speaker, or Szymborska herself, is conveying her lack of faith in humans being a divine species as a whole, and a personal preference of merely enjoying the company of other individuals. Striated religious aspects can also be interpreted, as Szymborska is directly rebutting the cardinal rule of Christianity of "love thy neighbour," and thus rhizomatic tendencies can be noted in Szymborska's opposing phrase. The next line of "I prefer keeping a needle and thread on hand, just in case," is a clear representation of individuality due to the unusualness of such a ritual, and also highlights Szymborska's skeptic mindset of larger concepts such as universalism. The speaker then returns to a more frivolous subject of colour preference, as she states, "I prefer the colour green, a colour of nature that is usually known to represent hope and rebirth." It is here where the speaker's preference for nature is first clearly hinted at, and links with the chaotic structure of the poem and natural disorder of the environment. In the next line, in which the speaker states, "I prefer not to maintain," enjambment is utilised for the first time, and thus emphasises on the diction maintain, which can be interpreted to be Szymborska's opposition of maintaining striated frameworks in society. However, in the next line brings about a different meaning through the phrase, "that reason is to blame for everything." Through such a specific phrase, it can be interpreted that the speaker is rebelling from typical beliefs that the majority maintain, and being that it is in opposition of the logical way of knowing, reasoning, perhaps this belief of the majority is somewhat irrational, which once again could link to religion, in which the primary way of knowing is faith. The speaker's trait of open-mindedness is then revealed in the next line, where she states, "I prefer exceptions," which jars with the restricting boundaries ideologies tend to create. Yet again, this act of rebellion against the norm contributes to the individualistic identity Szymborska has been constructing throughout the poem, and allows the reader to explore the complex mechanisms that exist within the speaker's mind. From lines 12 to 14, the speaker yet again mentions more frivolous preferences that are predictably relatable to an array of human beings. Through this, it can be interpreted that the speaker is making an attempt to convey that despite these preferences being trivial and somewhat unimportant to the masses, in terms of an individual, they are vital for constructing the immensely complex state of who they are. In line 15 and 16, an interesting statement is made by the speaker in which she states, "I prefer the absurdity of writing poems to the absurdity of not writing poems." Yet again, enjambment is used and thus initially deceives the reader into believing the speaker perceives the act of writing poems to be absurd, which perhaps to a large amount of people is the conventional mindset. However, humorously, it is revealed that the speaker makes the entrancing statement of the act of not writing poetry to be just as absurd to other people. From this, it can be interpreted that one of the underlying messages of the poem is that preferences do not equate to a single correct way of living, but rather are a link to one's own individuality. The speaker then continues to state, "I prefer, where love's concerned, non-specific anniversaries that can be celebrated every day," which yet again adds to the construction of this individual's character, as well as demonstrating her tendency to prefer things that are in a natural, unstructured manner. Enjambment is once again used, and this time to emphasize on the importance of non-specific anniversaries, further accentuating her preference of chaos. In line 19, the speaker states, "I prefer moralists," which is a person who promotes morality, or a philosopher concerned with moral principles. From this, it can be interpreted that the speaker has a preference for maintaining moral boundaries, and thus possesses a conventional mindset that is arguably contained by the majority. However, yet again, enjambment fools the reader, as the speaker reveals on the following line, "Who promised me nothing," and thus a characteristic of the speaker is revealed in that this phrase indicates a down-to-earth persona, in which rewards play no part in one's quest to maintain moral values, which is a primary motive for many religious beliefs. The next line then reveals, "I prefer cunning kindness to the over-trustful kind." Yet again, a preference that is unique and arguably held by the minority, the speaker is again demonstrating her pride in her uniqueness and lack of need to conform, as the diction cunning possesses negative connotations of deceit and evasion, and thus have a preference to such a thing as to be part of the minority. In the next few lines, it is clear that Szymborska sides with ordinary people rather than the impersonal mechanisms of history, as she states, "I prefer the earth in cities," which is of course a preference for an earth defined by its individualistic civilians, and "I prefer conquered to conquering countries," which takes a preference to those affected by tragedy rather than a collectively viewed conquering country. This line also links to Szymborska's pacifist nature, in which she believes war is injustifiable. The speaker then states a somewhat trivial preference for reservations, which adds to her individuality and emphasizes once again on the importance of each human trait, before moving to the next line where she states, "I prefer the hell of chaos to the hell of order." Arguably one of the most important phrases in the poem, it is here that Szymborska clearly states her preference for a rhizomatic world rather than the striated society that surrounds her. Ironically, she states that both states are equal to hell, yet nonetheless she takes preference to chaos. Through this, Szymborska questions the very purpose of maintaining a striated society, if it is just as hellish as that of a disorderly one, and provokes unsettling questions on the very basis that humans are founded upon within the reader. In the next line, the speaker continues to emphasize on her preference for things that do not concern violence and war through the sentence, "I prefer Grimm's fairy tales to the newspaper's front pages, in which the former is clearly a much more innocent and likeable concern than the commonly grim latter. The following few lines can be interpreted to be the speaker's attempt in conveying to the reader her preference of things kept in their natural state, as she says, "I prefer leaves without flowers to flowers without leaves," which, despite its apparent similarity upon first being read, upon later reflection, it can be interpreted that leaves without flowers are something that occur everywhere in nature, whereas flowers without leaves occur only when they have been interfered by a man. Furthermore, the speaker states her preference for dogs with uncropped tails, yet another interference by mankind. The next line then reveals another characteristic of the speaker by stating her preference for light eyes since hers are dark, yet this time it is a physical characteristic. Interestingly, in this phrase it can be interpreted that the speaker is accentuating the human tendency to favour or want something they do not possess, a never-ending sense of dissatisfaction within oneself. Continuing on, the speaker then expresses her favour of desk drawers, a simple and odd statement which is placed there perhaps to remind the reader of the simplicities in life that one may enjoy in the vast scheme of things, and the somewhat limiting state humans are confined to at times. However, in the next line, Szymborska conveys the endless ideas and preferences that exist within the human mind that literature could never fail to grasp in its limiting words. Could never fail to grasp, but literature could never grasp in its limiting words through the sentence, I prefer many things that I haven't mentioned here to many things I've also left unsaid. From this, it can also be interpreted that the thing that one prefers is not what is important, rather that it is the fact that humans have the ability to have a vast array of preferences that thus enables them to hope for multitudes of possibilities. In the next line, Szymborska builds once again on her preference for chaos and disorder, as she states, I prefer zeros on the loose to those lined up behind a cipher. With enjambment separating the line, it can be interpreted that the speaker is advocating her preference for freedom with diction such as on the loose, rather than being in a restricting code that is instigated by a cipher. In the next line, the speaker states her favour in the time of insects to the time of the stars, which can be interpreted as a preference for the time of life, be it human or not, to the time when only the ancient stars existed. This gives the reader insight into the speaker's mindset in that she seemingly possesses a favour towards the mystery and complexity of life, and unlike many, sees no beauty in that of the stars. It can be interpreted that Szymborska's skepticism is once again highlighted in the phrase, I prefer to knock on wood, which is a method done by many to avoid bad things happening to oneself, and thus this phrase is perhaps utilised in order to put the reader at ease, in that Szymborska is highlighting her mere human tendencies that one can easily relate to. The next phrase is of a more ambiguous type, in that it states, I prefer not to ask how much longer and when. This could mean an array of things, but the most likely interpretation is that it demonstrates the speaker's distaste towards concrete knowledge of the frightening future, which yet again is a highly relatable trait and further humanises the speaker. To end the poem, Szymborska lists her last preference of keeping in mind even the possibility that existence has its own reason for being. From this, it can be interpreted that despite her skepticism and critical thinking demonstrated through the majority of her poem, much like her title representing a sense of limitless, she too acknowledges the possibility of a purpose in life. An exploration of human individuality expressed fundamentally through our natural state of chaos, Szymborska successfully opens up about her own sense of self as well as evoking unsettling questions about humanity within the reader.